But I'm really happy to be here and speak before this distinguished group. So many issues to talk about. You know, I'm not going to elaborate on the helicopter that landed on the Capitol yesterday, but I just happened to be there when it happened, and it just sort of, you know, not a terrorist threat, but, you know, it illustrates the vulnerabilities that we have so close to home right here. As Nick mentioned, we marked up yesterday and passed unanimously the cybersecurity bill. And as you also mentioned, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but it should, because it's one of the more important issues. People say, what keeps you up at night? Well, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, my 5 teenagers. But cyber is one of those things out there that can cause, you know, the probability is high, and the damage, severe consequences, is very high as well in terms of what can be done. We have great offensive capability to shut things down. So does Russia. So does China. Iran is demonstrating great capability. Iran shut down 30,000 hard drives with Saudi Aramco, simultaneously hitting our financial sector on a daily basis. What this bill does, you know, last Congress, we're building on the success we had to authorize the Department of Homeland Security cyber security operations that Bush put in place under a presidential directive. And so it's working, but they didn't have the liability protections needed to have full participation by the private sector. So in this bill, it's really a liability protection bill. We afford liability protection to anyone, any company, member, voluntarily who wants to participate with the NKIC, as it's called, to share malicious code, threat signatures, cyber information with the federal government, and in turn we share information with them. And most importantly, because about 85% of this threat information resides in the private sector, we allow them to share private to private and give them liability protection. We think this will be transformational in terms of defending our networks in the private sector and also in the federal government, which I would argue is very vulnerable. I mean, every week we're learning about some new attack. You know, it took an attack on Hollywood with Sony to really get the attention of the American people. That was a very destructive attack by North Korea, shutting down in a very destructive way their hard drives. We saw Anthem compromise 80 million private healthcare records. Blue Cross Blue Shield hacked into. Target, Home Depot. Not to mention the espionage that's taken place from China, defense contractors, the blueprints of fighter planes, and the list goes on and on. So we marked that bill up. It's scheduled to be on the floor next week. And again, it doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but honestly it should, because it's one of the more important threats that I see. And my job, simplistically, is to identify threats outside the United States and prevent them from coming in. And cyber can be conducted anywhere in the world, anonymously. We see the cyber jihadist movement growing. Their intent is very high. They would love to take things down. Their capability, fortunately, at this point is low, but when that capability rises, you know, you got the theft of intellectual property, espionage, but then it's a cyber warfare piece that really does keep me out, because that capability could shut down the power grids in the Northeast, for instance, oil and gas sector, shut down our financial institutions. So this bill, I think, will go a long ways to protecting the nation from that kind of attack. I know my time's kind of limited. We want to do a Q&A, but I do want to touch on also ISIS. You know, it wasn't, I was briefed on ISIS probably a year and a half ago before it hit the news. and it has escalated over time. It was really the product of a couple of errors of judgment. There's sort of a false narrative that Al-Qaeda's on the run, and I was at Fort Hood last week awarding the Purple Hearts to the 12 soldiers who were killed by Major Hassan, who was talking to Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, asking for permission to do what he did, and yet that was downplayed as workplace violence. Benghazi was blamed on a video. Al-Qaeda was on the run after the killing of bin Laden. This was supposed to be over because that was the narrative. Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo. But it's not, unfortunately. I wish it was, but it's not over. And in Iraq, we were so fast to pull out without a status of forces agreement like we had in Germany after World War II, Japan, Korea. So fast to pull out. We didn't have a status of forces agreement, no residual force, and at the same time, Maliki is the political malfeasance on his part, not to negotiate with the Sunni tribes, but rather purge them. And Ms. Clinton visited Baghdad one time. We met with Condoleezza Rice. She said, Ms. Clinton went to Baghdad one time for 3 hours. The convergence of those two errors imploded Iraq and created ISIS. Al-Baghdadi, was part of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the genesis of what is modern day ISIS. Everybody's seen the movie American Sniper. That's what Chris Kyle is fighting, and that's the threat we face today. It wasn't until the beheadings occurred that the American people woke up to the fact that this narrative is a false narrative, that, the threat is still real. It's not just in Syria, in Iraq. This radical Islamist movement, and you have to call it that because that's what it is. If you ask them what it is, they'll tell you that's what it is spreading like a spider web, like a wildfire, across northern Africa and the Middle East. We had to pull out of our embassy in Yemen, and there goes our intelligence. We pulled out of Libya, there goes our intelligence there. And nation after nation, where there's a power vacuum, the terrorists prey on that. That's where they breed. And this threat is growing, not diminishing. And as that grows overseas, so too does the threat to the homeland. I appointed John Katko, former AUSA like myself for 20 years, really talented. And then Martha McSally, the first female combat pilot, on my committee. I'm just so proud to have these two stars, on my committee. But I appointed John to head up a task force to study 2 issues: foreign fighters and CVE, countering violent extremists, the homegrown radicalization. I was at a conference yesterday, roundtable, talking about the Boston bombing. Yesterday was the 2nd-year anniversary of the Boston bombing. Tamerlan, radicalized over the internet, but he also traveled to Dagestan and got radicalized by some pretty bad people, the Chechen rebels. I remember being on Face the Nation, and Bob Schieffer said, "What do you want to talk about?" I said, "I want to explain to the American people who these 2 brothers are, where they came from. The Chechen rebels, nobody knows who they are, most Americans. But I wanted to explain that the Chechen rebels killed a constituent son of mine in Fallujah. They fight alongside Al-Qaeda. But the radicalization that took place with Mr. Tamerlan, when he came back after all the flags went up, the Russians warned us, we missed it, he came back, got kicked out of his mosque, and then radicalized over the internet. You look at his website postings, black flags of Khorasan, very radical postings. That's the kind of thing that we need to stop. It's very hard to do. Major Hassan radicalized over the internet, communicated with Anwar al-Awlaki. Very difficult to stop these from occurring, but John is heading up the investigation into the 2 issues, and we'll lead a delegation over to the Middle East and Turkey, which is really the gateway for the foreign fighters' travel. Remember, ISIS is 50,000 and growing. these strikes have not diminished their capability. As Martha will tell you, the Air Force is so limited because the rules of engagement is zero collateral damage. We cannot be successful with those kind of rules. We have a policy of containment, not to destroy and defeat ISIS. So they have actually grown in numbers in recruiting since the strikes. It's not like bin Laden with caves and couriers. This is the most sophisticated social media campaign we've ever seen. You know, showing us the beheadings, the Jordanian pilot being lit up on fire in a cage, and it actually is drawing more recruits. So 50,000 ISIS and growing, 30,000 of those are foreign fighters from all over the world. 5,000 have Western passports, and hundreds of Americans have traveled to the region. Many have returned, and we are monitoring them. But that's just who we know. As I mentioned, we've had to pull out so much and disengage from the region and become so isolationist that we don't have a human footprint and capability to determine who is there. These numbers, in my judgment, are very deflated. I think the numbers are much higher. And that is of great concern to me as a chairman of Homeland Security, is who is in this country already. And even if you haven't traveled to the region and back, the social media campaign is so intense and so viral globally that you don't even have to do that. You can radicalize in your basement like Tamerlan did and pull off a terrorist attack. So these are very, very important issues that we're dealing with. We don't have a lead agency in the federal government. We don't have a line item in the budget to deal with this issue. And I think our report is going to be very revealing about what we need to do to combat this. And finally, we need to have better community engagement with the Muslim community in the United States. You know, I used to do that when I was a federal prosecutor. I know John probably did too, but you know, we'd walk into a mosque with an FBI agent. It's a little chilling. I mean, they don't really want to talk to somebody like me or the FBI, but I think there are people in the community that we can deploy to the mosques and the Muslim community to identify those who are radicalizing, as Tamerlan did when he was kicked out of his mosque. And Hassan we knew about, and Fort Hood was not warned about him, unfortunately. So these are kind of the grave issues of the day. I always like to end on it. You know, I always think that I do have a sense of humor, but when I'm on television, everybody's like, you know, you seem like you're so grim. You know, you talk about death and destruction all the time. That's kind of my job. And I do like to end on a positive note. My dad was a bombardier on a B-17 in World War II, and he was part of the air campaign in the D-Day invasion, Battle of the Bulge, and we're going to have the opportunity to go to Normandy on our trip. But I remember when I was in Iraq, and the soldiers pointed out Abraham's house to me, and I just was really kind of blown away. I thought, you know, this is the house where the three major religions came out of. It won't happen in my life. This is a war of ideology at the end of the day. And we can do drone strikes and kill them, but at the end of the day, it's a war of ideology. Our ideas are better. They're very backwards. And at the end of the day, we win this war of ideology, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I want it to happen in my children's lifetime. And looking at that house, to see the three major religions coexist peacefully under the house of Abraham, I think is the goal that we have. And so with that, I know we've got a Q&A session coming up, but I just want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Thank you.
So, if we could get our other two guests up here, and then you can introduce them, Mr. Chairman, and then have each of them give some brief remarks as to what they're doing in their subcommittees. And
So So I think I've already introduced him, but
You can do it again.
so John is Katko, New York. Comes from both of these, they come from competitive districts, but they are really star players on my team. And John, as I mentioned, was a federal prosecutor for 20 years, great investigative experience, which is why I appointed him to lead the task force. Martha chairs the subcommittee on the transportation, and she comes from a border state. I led a delegation of 25 members, the largest delegation to ever go down the border. We went to Martha's district, met with her ranchers who were in town yesterday, and it's good for members to see the border, because a lot of these members from places that aren't even close to the border think that the answer is a 30-foot concrete wall. When you go down there, you realize the ranchers certainly don't want that, and they realize that technology is really the answer to getting operational control of the border. She's a real expert on that, a real leader. I think won by, 150 votes?
67.
Sorry, 67 votes.
Don't take those last 17 votes away from me.
And her predecessor, Ron Barber, was on the committee, but she is just such a great addition to the team. And first female combat pilot in United States history, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Actually, this is, if you don't mind me telling the story, defied the Department of Defense when they asked her to wear a burqa, because she thought that was not necessary, and actually filed a lawsuit against Donald Rumsfeld and won. And she is tough.
And he donated to my campaign. I'm serious, he did. It's pretty cool.
So I'll stop talking, but these are
After I kicked his butt, exactly.
these are two real superstars on the committee. So just a round of applause at these two.
Well, I'll just give a quick introduction to follow up on. First of all, thank you for your comments, and I appreciate it. And having a chairman of a subcommittee, or chairman of a committee like Homeland Security, who empowers young representatives like Martha and myself, it's really inspiring. And I'll just speak in a moment about what I've learned already from that empowerment. But I started out my career as a federal prosecutor on the southwest border, and I was prosecuting cartel-level drug traffickers there and in Puerto Rico. In the last 16 years as an organized crime prosecutor in Syracuse, New York, which covered a 32-county area. So I have a lot of investigatory skills that suit me well with the Homeland Security, and I absolutely love it. I'm on transportation and infrastructure as well, but I'm just having a ball with Homeland Security. And I just want to touch one thing I've learned very quickly. I echo all the sentiments about the problems we have with terrorism, and it's a tall task we have, but I'm also heartened by the fact that there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good work at the counterterrorism centers, and much more collaborative work than I saw when I was an organized crime prosecutor, because federal agencies didn't always get along so well. And they're doing a lot better now, and I think necessity is mother of invention, and they really are working together well. But I want to talk to one thing I learned about being a representative early on was the chairman gave me chair of the Transportation Security Subcommittee, which included a TSA. And early on, it became readily apparent when I was getting ready to work on that committee that airports across this nation have a gigantic security lapse. And when you talk about the radicalization over the internet, I just, the prime fear is one of these workers, one of the tens of thousands of workers at the airports, was disgruntled about something, could do something very bad. And I realized that none of them were getting screened when they go into work every day. They could access the secure areas of the airport even on the off days. The screening process is lax at best. Atlanta, for example, had 64 different entry points for employees, and they weren't getting screened. It's pretty scary. It all came to light because a fellow from Atlanta got caught carrying a backpack with 16 loaded guns on an airplane, getting off an airplane in New York, 2 of which were automatic weapons, and all of them loaded. And he said that was his 10th trip he took doing that, and found out that a low-level employee in Atlanta would carry the backpacks in a secure area, give them the backpack, and the guy would get on the plane. And that's how the whole thing happened. So I said, well, let's call a subcommittee hearing and let's investigate that. And I thought that they were going to come to me and it would be a big brawl because I had representatives from the airlines, from the airport associations, and thought that, no, we don't need any changes. And this is what I learned. Simply by calling and identifying the right issue and calling a hearing on it, we made a gigantic change in the way security is done nationwide at airports. Because they came not to fight us, they came to capitulate. And almost, they came with plans presenting us as to what they want to do to change. And even before we come back, we have a follow-up hearing. We formed a commission. This commission results had just been come out, and we're going to fix that hole. And we also found out, for example, Atlanta's going from 64 entry points to 4, and 100% screening, no access to their employees outside of work hours. So it was a very valuable lesson for me that if you do your homework and your staff does your homework, and I have a wonderful staff right here. Kyle, where are you? Kyle is doing a terrific job in that committee for me. You can really make change. So you have to identify the right issues and not just, it can't be fluff, but when you identify the right issues, you can make change simply having the hearing, and we're going to do that. And of course, we'll have some legislation coming out of that, but there's a lot to learn. But when you have someone like Mr. McCaul who empowers us, and we're hungry, and Martha and I are indeed hungry, and we become fast friends because we're very similar ilk, and it's very inspiring. And we're doing good work on the committee, and it's scary, but at the same time, we're doing everything we can to make this country as safe as it possibly can be. So with that, I'll introduce you to one of my really true buddies in Congress. We get along very well, and it's an honor to sit here with her, and it's kind of humbling because she's a nut, being a fighter pilot. But, I fought bad guys, and I got threats once in a while, but she's crazy. And,
Crazy in a good way, right? So, thank you. Yeah, thanks, John. I agree. People ask all the time. This is our 101st day in office. It's like freshmen in high school, like, who are your friends? What clique are you in, or whatever? And I'm constantly naming John Katko, Will Hurd, another member of our committee, former CIA operative, just great Americans here, doing good work, smart, committed, in tough seats. But it's really great to be joined by individuals like John and also Will Hurd. And I hope you guys get to meet him as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Really appreciate working for Chairman McCaul. It's a great opportunity to be on the Homeland Security Committee, great opportunity to be given the subcommittee chair. I mean, that's really a big deal as a freshman, and so I echo John's comments. I appreciate being empowered and having the opportunity to serve and make a difference. Being on Homeland Security is a right fit for my background. I've been doing national security for 30 years, since the day I left for the Air Force Academy with my combat boots and bras over my shoulders. That's what we showed up with. To go to basic training, 26 years, retiring as a colonel, a couple master's degrees on the issue, and not just flying in combat, but also operational positions at the senior level. As a colonel, I was running our counterterrorism operations in Africa at U.S. Africa Command, just as an example. So I really saw up close how flawed some of our policies have been, and how we've watched these Al-Qaeda affiliates and Islamist extremists grow and metastasize all over the world. I mean, under our watch, I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but under our watch, we watched Al-Shabaab, AQIM in West Africa, Boko Haram. I mean, they were continuing to take advantage of ungoverned spaces, kidnapping Westerners in order to build up their coffers so that they could actually continue to buy weapons and arms that they did once Libya fell into chaos. Al-Shabaab, just an example of, we were watching thousands of terrorists being trained in terrorist camps by Al-Shabaab, and we repeatedly went up the chain of command and asked, please, we've got to do something about this. I mean, they're out in the middle of nowhere. There's no civilian casualties. They're literally, like the videos you see, they're doing their graduation ceremonies of the Al-Qaeda, clearly Al-Qaeda affiliated training camps. And these guys are going to go harm our interests in the region, and they certainly don't want to just put up white picket fences. They want to continue to build the caliphate and grow and take down the West. And we tee up potential operations, and they just repeatedly, nope, it's not in our national interest, not our problem. It's not, we don't care about it. This is a regional issue, and now you see what's going on with the students in Kenya and the Mall in Kenya. I mean, these are the same assholes. Excuse my language. Oh.
I was not the first to swear
I'm
for
sorry.
change. I'm very happy about that.
These are the same guys who said that, we're inspiring people to go after, the balls. This is Al-Shabaab. A lot of people, oh, what's Al-Shabaab? And I'm telling you, 2008, 2010, we watched these guys, likely some of the graduate from these camps that we knew about and let go because we failed to take military action. And I agree, this is a generational threat, and we've got to counter the ideology, but we got to kill a lot of them too. And so, coming from a military background, you are not going to convert these guys into Boy Scouts or Boy Scout leaders. We, no kidding, I mean, I'll go off on a tangent here, but we would, no kidding, sometimes identify some leaders in East Africa, Al-Qaeda, that had gone underground, but then they popped up again that were responsible for the 1998 bombings in Africa, and we would, as many of you may know, intelligence comes together usually at a moment in time maybe that you haven't expected it to. You've been working it for many, many years, and then somebody finally pops, and then you're able to get the human or the SIGINT or whatever that you've got them, you've watched the pattern of life, and there they are. And we would tee up like, we need to go get this guy. And repeatedly, it was like, well, they were involved in the 1998 bombings, but what have they done lately? Like, are you kidding me? They're not, again, they're not teaching Sunday school, I mean, they're responsible for the death of Americans and others in Africa, but it was very frustrating to see the short-sightedness as this threat was growing and metastasizing. So we are in, I think, the most complex and dangerous world that I've lived in, and I've been doing national security for 30 years. So it's an absolute honor to be on this committee. As one of 9 border districts, I'm also on the Border and Maritime Subcommittee, so I think it's just absolutely an important issue for our public safety. We've got these cartels, transnational criminal organizations that are trafficking through my communities into your communities, and so this is a national threat. It's very serious. It's not just an immigration issue. It is a public safety issue with the drugs and the weapons and the money and the human trafficking that's happening, in our community. So it was great to be able to bring. I really appreciate the chairman organizing that CODEL to bring over 20 members of Congress down to the border to see firsthand what we're dealing with in southern Arizona. So very important. The subcommittee I chair is Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. And so we've got oversight. There's a difference, as I'm learning, between legislative oversight and just legislative authority and oversight authority. So we have broad oversight of FEMA, and under DHS, the Offices of Emergency Communication and the Office of Health Affairs. So far, we've had a couple of visits, to just interact with the leaders of each of those organizations. We've had one hearing on the threat of chemical terrorism, and next week we're going to have a hearing on the threat of bioterrorism. I worked for Senator Kyle back in 1999 to 2000 on counterterrorism issues, and I'll tell you, the threats that we were looking at back then, to include cyber, the complex threats of an asymmetrical strike where someone could maybe use a chem attack or a dirty bomb or something that was really sort of low tech, combined with a cyber attack to potentially take down the public safety, communications infrastructure, and those types of things, the electrical grid. I mean, those are the things that we were looking at as serious threats back in 1999 and 2000. And quite frankly, we've not done a whole lot in order to move things forward in those areas. And so this cybersecurity bill is a really important bill to be addressing that. And look, these are difficult threats. For anyone serving in the military here, is any veterans? So, I mean, we deal with the chemical threat, and we exercise all the time. I mean, even being an A-10 pilot, every time we exercise, it's how to operate and fly and conduct operations in a chemical environment. So we're constantly training on, no kidding, diving into ditches, donning on all your equipment, how are you going to decontaminate, how are you going to continue to operate. It is not intuitive. And so one thing that we learned, even in that last hearing, from those who could be out there anywhere in the country, health officials and others that might be on the front lines, first responders dealing with a chem attack, I mean, how to make sure that you can detect, respond, and decontaminate. I mean, we had to do it, no kidding, once a month in exercises as a whole base in order to make sure we knew all those procedures. And so if we're just expecting our first responders to figure that out, where they're not given the resources and the continuity and the best practices to be able to do that right, we've got definitely a vulnerability there. So we talked a lot about that in that last hearing, and as I mentioned, next week we'll be talking about bioterrorism. So it's an absolute honor to be serving on this committee and serving in this Congress after 1,049 days of campaigning. and 167 vote landslide victory. So I appreciate your coming out today. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Great.